People asked for a little more information about building this jig for the curved strips, and they also asked about using them in an end grain cutting board. And I wouldn't do that because this is a cross grain situation. So I'm going to make another version of this jig, and this time I'm going to try to make an end grain version of the strips. And I would like to build up the whole cutting board out of these, but the curvature is quickly going to get out of hand. So I'm going to make it a double-sided jig. One side will make these concave strips, and the other side will make a convex strip. But the first thing we need is the blanks for these strips, because we need one of those to set up the jig. I've cut some fairly wide boards into thirds, and now I'll glue that into a panel. I'm not overly worried about getting this perfectly aligned, because after I cut it down into strips, I'll run all those through the drum sander. I could have straightened the edge with the track saw, but I'm trying to show you can do this mostly with a table saw. So alternatively, I can just cut the first strip oversized and then trim it. They don't have to be absolutely straight, and they get straighter as you keep cutting them. Once I get both sides flat with the drum sander, I rip the strips in half. And here I'm surprised by how much the walnut strips are cupping as they come off the saw. Even though I'm going to cut one side again with the jig, so I don't really need both sides to be flat, I sand the fresh to cut side anyway. I figured I wouldn't do the tapering on all the strips, and the way they warped, I wanted to have flexibility on which side to choose. Now that we have a strip, we can start on the jig. And the first step is to make shallow notches at each end. These are for the stops that hold the strip on the outside. Note that there's no need to make these stops the right thickness, as they'll get trimmed off when you make the first cut. The rest of the stops need to be made slightly shorter than the strip. Once the middle stop is in place, I want to point out that at this stage, with only 3 points of contact, the strip can be any thickness as long as it's able to bend. But as soon as we add in the intermediate stops, we're locked into a specific thickness. I thought about making them adjustable, but it's just so much easier to glue them and be done with it. Perhaps I'll be regretting this in a few minutes of video time. On the convex side, it's the same process. I first glue down the center and outer stops, then bend a strip against them to locate the intermediate stops. These thin pieces at the back of the stop will greatly improve the effectiveness of the clamps, which just get screwed into the stops. I wasn't sure if clamps alone would be enough to hold the strip on the convex side, but they seem to do the job just fine. That means, at least for the end grain strips, that the stops at the ends of the concave side are redundant, and I could have made all my strips quite a bit shorter. I had my doubts about whether my saw was going to be up to this cut, but it went okay with this thin kerf combination blade. There was some burning on the first cut or two, but that was due to me changing my hand position in the middle of the cut. I found as long as I kept my hands in the same spot and kept up a slow, steady feed rate, the cut quality was very good, even on this 1.5 horsepower saw. The big issue is it takes about 2 minutes to cycle a strip out and get a new one back into the jig. It works, but it's just not very efficient. I have some ideas on how to speed this up, but that's for a future video. Note that I marked the strips with an arrow indicating which way was up when it was cut. And in the glue up, I'm alternating the arrows in an attempt to balance out any overall error. Putting a couple clamps on vertically keeps the strips from sliding around up and down. It's a good idea to take these off once you've got things together and the initial slipperiness of the glue is over, to make sure they aren't hiding any gaps. After the second glue up, I checked how square the edge was, and one end wasn't bad, but the other was way off. I used a flush trim bit to remove as much as I could, and then the rest on the spindle sander. So it appears that my attempt at balancing out any issues didn't work, although this didn't happen with the other board, so I don't know. So I created a problem, and I already solved it without getting it on video. So we're using the finished board as an example, but I created a curve that the concave strips can bend into, but the straight ones and the convex ones just break, because these are a lot more flexible. Also, I don't think I have enough strips to finish 2 boards. So I'm making more strips, but this time I'm ripping them off center, so I'll have a thicker strip I'll use for the concave strips, and the thinner one will be for the convex. This should make the 2 strips more similar in how much they can bend. And I won't waste wood making the convex one thinner. Of course, this means I have to change the stops on the jig, but it's still easier to just glue them back in the new places rather than make them adjustable at this point. I think the cumulative error I had was due to blade deflection, so now I'm trying a full kerf rip blade. The load on the saw seems to be about the same as with the thin kerf combination blade. So I think this first one turned out well. I haven't flattened it and sanded it, but I don't see any major issues with this one. This one does have issues, though. There's a gap over here, and there's a gap over here. This one, I could just cut the last strip off. I don't really care about that. But there's also a gap on this side, so I can't, make one in the bottom and not have any gaps on the top. I don't like the idea of filling it with epoxy and hoping for the best. So I think I have to cut this apart and try and get it back together again, which is not going to be fun. But I think that's what I have to do. After a lot of fussing that the camera decided you wouldn't like to see, I was able to get it back together again. Unfortunately, my dust collector was out of commission for a few days, and so I couldn't use the drum sander. So I tried using the jointer, and the carbide cutters were up to the task, using a very light cut. And I made the other side parallel using a router sled. This left a pretty rough surface, so I went back to the jointer, and that got me really close to a finished surface. I think these turned out great, and there's all kinds of patterns you could come up with, but we got to talk a little bit about the efficient use of materials. I've done the math, and not including surfacing the lumber down from rough sawn, only about a quarter of the wood that I started with actually ended up in the cutting boards. The other 3/4 of my money is in a barrel of sawdust. So there's about $65 to $70 worth of retail priced lumber in one of these boards. I did learn ways to be more efficient in the process, so let's say 60. A very crude way of estimating a price you're going to sell your work at is 3 times materials cost. So that would put these at $180, which is not completely out of line, but it's at the high end. And it's weird, I think, like if you're turning something, it's just understood that only a small percentage of the wood you started with is going to actually end up in the bowl or whatever you're making. But somehow, these being basically rectangular blocks of wood, there's an expectation that you didn't use a whole lot more wood than what you're looking at. And so, it's just a little bit odd, I think.